I would like to introduce all of you to Mr. Lloyd Kelly. Lloyd and I met back when the monkeys were ruling the earth and the earth was just starting to cool. It's been several decades since we worked together, but Lloyd has been one of my go-to experts and one of the premier movers and shakers in the Canadian publishing market for, Lloyd, I'm not going to say how long, 20, 25 years now?
It's over 30 years, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, we met 25 years ago, and he has been and continues to be quite the name in Canada. He has recently started Lloyd Consulting Agency, but before that, he was VP of Sales and Marketing at HarperCollins. Went on to become VP of another division of HarperCollins Canada, if I remember correctly. And you worked for Nielsen, correct?
Nelson Education.
Nelson Education. I'm sorry, I pronounced it wrong. We pronounce things differently down here in the lower 48. So Lloyd and I were talking, like you do, and I said, boy, Lloyd, the one thing that everyone's always asking me about that I can't answer is what is going on with the Canadian market? How can we get into this? So we're going to do a little bit of homework here before I let Lloyd take off, and I'm going to ask him all your questions, I promise. I would love to ask if you guys down at the bottom of your screen, if you would click on the Q&A tab right on the bottom of your screen. For most of you, it's at the bottom. One or two of you, depending on your version of Zoom, it may be at the top, but there is a Q&A screen. And if you go to the question box and type in your questions, I would be so grateful. So if you would go to the question box right now and just type in, yes, we can hear you, or hi, or tell me how pretty I look today wearing, you know, my pink. All right, well, Katie and Ilya, hi, good to see you. Oh, thank you, Tom. And okay, good. So you guys are all finding the Q&A box. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to dismiss some of these questions, but we are going to, as Lloyd and I are talking, I would like you to type your questions into this question box. And we will try and get to all of the questions by the end of this hour. We're gonna do our best, and if not, Lloyd is going to very gently, very kindly gave us his website. You can see there right under his charming visage, the word Lloyd Kelly, but also Kelly Consulting Agency. And we can get a hold of him and ask questions later, correct, Lloyd?
Yes, you can.
All right. Well, Lloyd, I'd like to start by asking you the big question that I have. What, in your opinion, is the biggest misconception or the biggest, I don't want to say mistake, but erroneous thinking that you see a lot of authors laboring under when they try and enter into or publish into the Canadian market? What's one of the big misconceptions that you've seen in your years?
Well, I've seen it many times. You know, it's when I think authors or a publisher from the U.S. Assumes that because the book is already well established in the U.S. market, it's going to naturally take off in Canada. It's never really that way until it hits a really giant scale, and then yes, it can accelerate just as quickly in Canada. But if it's a good, say a solid bestseller in the U.S. market, it doesn't mean that it's going to translate into a bestseller at all in the Canadian market. There's definitely a curve across our border, and sometimes the books will bounce up against that curve and bounce back. Others just can bounce right over. So never assume that, oh, my book's already successful here. It's an easy success. You know, it's easy for my book to become successful in Canada. And
all right.
Yeah, there are a few differences.
One of the questions that someone has already, you guys, you're doing great asking these questions. I so commend you. Kizzy, thank you. And guys, we're going to get to these questions. I do have a few questions that I'd like to ask him first, but I promise we'll get to yours. Lloyd, one of the things that you and I were talking about before we got started was the sales numbers. What makes a bestseller in Canada versus what makes a bestseller in the United States? For instance, the top-selling book last week in the United States sold over 60,000 copies in 1 week. And you were talking about the #1 seller in Canada, which has the charming title of The Simple Art of Not Giving an F. I'm paraphrasing. And you had found the Canadian sales for that. Do you want to share with us a little bit about the numbers, maybe, so we can talk a little bit about what makes a bestseller in Canada versus U.S.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this helps provide some perspective, I think. So The Simple Art of Not Giving a F has sold about 200,000, just over 200,000 copies in paperback in 52 weeks, the entire last year. That gives you some relativity in terms of what, books sell in the U.S. Probably that book's into the millions of copies, combined editions. I think you're selling both paperback and hardcover at this point now.
Now, you and I both know that Canadians love a cheeky, quirky, inappropriate title, correct?
Absolutely, yes. Right. You gravitate towards them.
But you had mentioned that there were some big differences between the United States market and the Canadian market. Are there any hard and fast rules, or even slightly gray rules that, in terms of those differences, you can share with us?
Yeah, well, I think one thing to just to help build some perspective here is that approximately 21% of Canadians speak French as their first language. And so there's a fifth of the market, more or less wiped out. Most times that French population will only buy French books.
Now, how many Canadians are up there?
Okay, so 37 million Canadians.
And 20% of them don't even speak English.
Well, they do. They potentially speak English, but they probably are not going to buy an English language book due to protectionist laws in Quebec, especially. They've been very, very protective of their society and their language. And for instance, if you go into a coffee shop now in Quebec, you were previously greeted "Hello, bonjour." Now it's illegal to say hello. They can only say bonjour to you. So there are no English signs as well. So that's how tight the protectionism is there, because they're just surrounded by English everywhere.
All right.
So that's one big factor to keep in mind. The second is where Canada is quite the melting pot here, as is the U.S. We have virtually every language in the world spoken here in Canada, especially in Toronto and of course in Vancouver. And that makes up another 14% of the market who have reported not speaking English or French as their first language. So that's about a third of the country that professes to not speak English as their first language. So that's something to keep in mind. And when people say, well, the Canadian population is roughly 10% of the US population, it's definitely not 10% of the publishing numbers. Mm-hmm. And there are a few other factors I could talk about that also weigh into that. One of them being is there's quite a significant Canadian publishing, a number of Canadian publishing programs here. Many of those books become huge bestsellers here and don't sell a copy outside the country because they're so Canadian.
Do you have an example?
Well, a lot of hockey books, political books. It's sorry to be so typical about it, but
poutine cookbooks.
Yeah, right. Try it, you'd love it. And the sort, there are a huge number of books here in Canada for our population to absorb. So we get virtually all the books from the U.S. market. We also get so many books from the UK market that don't go into the US market as well. And so add that to it's a fairly robust Canadian publishing program or programs here. This is just another reason why if someone's book is sold 100,000 copies in the US, it does not mean it's going to sell 10,000 copies in Canada.
Now, Lloyd, guys, I need to apologize. I gave Lloyd 5 or 6 sample questions, but I'm going off script already. We're 5 minutes in, and because now you're making me think of other questions. And guys, we are going to get to your questions, I promise. But Lloyd, you mentioned the UK market, shipping books into Canada.
Yes.
In your experience, are the Canadian bookstores, booksellers, librarians, and readers more comfortable with a UK published book in some cases than a US published book?
Previously, I'd say yes, that was very much the case. As the world has become more global, especially with Amazon, that has lessened greatly. But there's a lot of great British mystery writers that are fringe writers, maybe that come into Canada that Americans may never see.
So we've got a lot more competition than just other Canadian authors.
That's true. I think many people would say here we have potentially the richest and most diverse publishing market in the world.
Now, as a former HarperCollins Canada god, I'll just say it, I'm curious about business books. How do business books from the U.S. translate over the border in Canada? Now, I understand our tax guides are not going to do very well up there, but one of the things I'm the most curious about is, do our business practices, our leadership practices, how do they do up there?
Great. Especially if they're on your bestseller list, they will translate up here very well. And again, as long as it's not too deeply rooted in financial advice or taxation, anything that's specifically American. If it's broad-based business books, which I can't think of one of right now, but I'm sure it'll come to me.
Good to Great by Jim Collins comes to mind.
I'm trying to think, what the heck is that? It's probably right behind me here on the shelf. I loved it. It was a great book, and it did extremely well for us here in Canada. So, yeah, as long as it's not specific to the U.S. market, then, yeah, we can do very well with U.S. business books.
Which leads me to one more of my questions, and then I am going to take a few questions from the audience before I slip back into, Lloyd, what I promised was going to be a very straightforward series of questions that you prepped for. But here we go. Tell me about Canadian spelling and UK spelling. Does that make a difference to bookstores, libraries, and readers up in Canada? Do all those extra U's help?
Well, ultimately, no. It might at the beginning of the day when a Canadian publishing company is looking at selling and distributing, but at the end of the day, Canadians, we buy so many books with American spelling, so many books with their own Canadian spelling, it doesn't matter.
Right.
If there comes a point there when it might, and that's if you have a separate Canadian publishing deal. So you might be with HarperCollins or somebody at Penguin Random House in the U.S., and it doesn't mean that that book will just go globally with them only. And I could talk about that a bit too. That might be of interest.
Well, yes, please.
Okay. So in that case, where a separate Canadian market deal would be arrived at, then yeah, the spellings would all get changed, and any other nuances that are just, that would make it look too or sound too American and would help the sale of the book, then they would get changed by the editorial staff here in Canada, whomever the publisher is.
All right.
So then we actually even reword things that just don't make quite a, they're just not as clear. So, it's more than just spellings. It could be editorial doctoring of sentences or structure.
All right. Yeah. For those of you who are noticing that my eyes are shifting, I'm simply reading the oncoming questions. You guys are doing great with these questions. You're doing wonderfully. So, Lloyd, we're going to, the big question that a number of people are asking, and guys, I'm going to take some of your questions and just, and morph them into one big question, the big questions for Lloyd. But let's talk a little bit about the Canadian retail, bookstore retail market at the moment, if we can. I mean, you've been selling into this market for a very long time, leaving aside readers, which you've, great stats, and thank you for that. But the actual bookstores themselves at this point, how do booksellers, book buyers, how do they feel about U.S. authors and U.S. books in general? Do you have a general feeling of their opinion of us as a group?
Excellent. We appreciate them because that's what drives many, if not, a great majority of the bestsellers are American books. So we welcome them.
Mm-hmm.
As long as it sells through and is successful, there's no resistance whatsoever.
Well, now you mentioned bestsellers. Can you give those of us who are listening here, because I have no idea, you already had one number for us, but can you give us an idea of what a bestseller in Canada might sell?
Yeah.
You throw some numbers at us, guys, because I'll compare it to the U.S. market.
Right. So I'd say in the top 10, The Handmaid's Tale is a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret Atwood. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows Margaret Atwood globally, more or less, I would say. Probably Canada's most famous author, although she's not number one, oddly enough. But she is the most recognized. Her Handmaid's Tale book sold 108,000 copies last year in Canada. Now, it's an old book. I don't know if I have the date here. Well, this is a new edition. They repackaged it, but it goes back, I don't know, maybe 15 years or something. I'm not sure.
And we here in the States, we sold 2.8 million copies of that book. Now, that's across the paperback and ebook. But yeah, okay. So you're right, nowhere near 10%.
No, we had a few editions running of that book here in Canada, I see, like throughout the bestseller list. And the thing is, the market here would be more saturated already for that book. Mm-hmm. She's already
a Canadian author that
so many people would have had that book already, whereas, potentially in the U.S. market, she was new to many people.
When you were with a traditional publisher back in the day, mm-hmm. and you had a new book come out by a first-time author, mm-hmm. and you were selling into the Canadian market, let's take another category, self-help, just general. I know you sold self-help books mm-hmm. in your a lot of them.
For sure.
Just a general number. Can you toss out for us what sort of monthly, annual sales, or whatever number you want to come up with, what would have made you happy as a HarperCollins VP of sales in terms of the Canadian market for a new first-time author? What would have said to you, okay, mm-hmm. this book is a nice, strong mid-list, not anything huge, but it's working. This will work for me.
Yeah, that sounds like about 1,000 copies.
1,000 copies during what time frame?
In its first year.
Okay, folks, 1,000 copies in a year would make HarperCollins happy.
Because of the vast list, you got to remember you're competing with, it's just one publishing company, hundreds and hundreds of new titles per year, per month especially, I should say, never mind per year, it'd be in the thousands per year, titles.
Yeah.
So, until it gets to, there's levels. So there are all sorts of curves, I guess, using my previous illustration of hitting that curve. Once it gets up there, though, it can be in the tens of thousands.
Yes. Yeah. Now, you were with one of the major players, and you're talking about competition. The competition is fierce because we're not only as independent publishers and as authors, we're not only competing against each other, we're competing against you guys in the big houses. Who are the big players up in Canada? Who is our competition?
Yeah, well, it's pretty similar to the competition in the U.S. Penguin Random House dominates approximately 27% of the market here. And then that's followed by HarperCollins. HarperCollins around 12%. So those two players right there now, we're getting, that's about 40%.
40% of the market, yeah.
Yeah, two players. And then if we throw Simon & Schuster in there, that's another 10%. Mm-hmm. Add in Hachette, that's another 10%. I don't know if I reached that. I calculated it was around 60% of the market in Canada is controlled by 4 players now. So that's good and bad. Like if somebody has written a book and you happen to be with one of them, then that's a pretty powerful story. But that still leaves 40% of the market for a lot of much smaller players where you could be a big fish in a small pond.
Mm-hmm.
And be taken much more seriously, and that 1,000 that might have been at HarperCollins could be more. Maybe it doubles. With a smaller publisher, they're more focused. They don't have hundreds of books coming at them all at once. If they really believe in it, and if there's a Canadian angle to it of some sort, it doesn't have to be, there needs to be something that will help break it out in Canada to get it from that, let's call that mediocre, 1,000 copies level, up into 2,000 or 3,000 would be very successful in Canada. So there's different strategies about what the best publisher is, who's the best fit, and even down to the individual publishers within a publisher, who's the best fit for that book, and trying to get to know them. So,
all right.
Yeah. And I was also just going to give perspective, if this is okay. I don't know if this is the best time, but just give kind of like the retail landscape a little bit. Give a little.
Please, yes.
And again, the retail landscape is dominated by one major retailer here. I guess much like in the U.S., your Barnes & Noble, we have Indigo. Indigo purchased Chapters and Coles, I don't know, at least 15 years ago, and have become the one major book retailer in Canada. Coles stores, that's the brand that they use in their mall stores location. And the standalone stores, the big footprint superstores, are called Indigo, and there's still some that are named Chapters.
Lloyd, how are your malls doing up there and your mall stores?
It's they decline. They decline every year. Small declines, a couple percent down most years, I would say. They're taking the hardest hit, and it's really because of, I would say, online selling. It's dominated by Amazon.
Well, we're going to talk about Amazon in a second, especially Amazon.ca, but these Coles and Chapters Indigo, do any of these booksellers that you're aware of have rules, guidelines, or wishes when it comes to having Canadian pricing and American pricing on the book? Or is there some rules that perhaps we should be following that we're unaware of?
Yeah. They're not rules. They'll put your book out if it's not properly priced, but it's not a good idea. It's always essential to get that Canadian price on the book, either pre-printed with the U.S. price. That's most commonly done. But when
we believe in price embedding our barcodes. I will tell any of you, do not put 9000 at the end of your barcode. Bookstores, they want to know what the price of your book is. They want to buy it knowing that you're a professional publisher who priced your book at a price it's going to stay at during the life of that book.
Yeah. And that's actually another point. It doesn't always stay at that price in Canada because of the currency fluctuations. So there's a lot of stickering that can happen here. We go through a lot more stickers than anywhere else probably because of price fluctuations due to the currency, and then also because some books are not marked with a Canadian price.
All right. Good to know. So you guys are a little more friendly with stickers than we are down here in the States.
Yeah, we have to be still. Unfortunately, we just can't get away from it. We have control over the book where there's a relationship with the U.S. publisher. We advise them, please, sticker all your books, or sorry, pre-print the Canadian price on your books so we don't have to sticker them.
All right. All right. So Lloyd, I got to tell you, you're 25 minutes now into this interview. How you doing? Yeah, we have like 100 questions coming in. I'm telling you. So drink that water. Take a deep breath. We got a lot of interest here in your topic. Talk a little bit. You, on top of being a sales expert and a marketing expert, and guys, we are going to get to your questions about how to market in Canada. I promise. But before I do, you were talking about how 60% of the market is the top 4 or 5 publishers.
Yes.
You are also an agent. You actually, you work with publishers to get publishing deals. Can you give a short list or a little overview as to what might make either a U.S. or a Canadian author more appealing to a Canadian publisher than they are right now?
Yeah. Well, the biggest thing is having some kind of platform in Canada as well. Not all of your media, most of it comes over the border, but not all of it. And so if you can arrange for interviews with the Canadian media, press, talk shows, whatever it lends properly to your book, then that gives you an angle when you try to sell separate Canadian rights to a Canadian publisher. And that Canadian publisher may include the multinationals the big four companies that I named, except Hachette does not have a Canadian publishing program, but the others do, and they're huge. The Penguin Random House Canada publishing program is huge.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Now, you mentioned media up in Canada. What are some of the big heavy hitters that, you know, like down here in the States, if you end up on Ellen, you're going to sell some books. If you end up in People magazine, you're going to end up in books. So tell me, are there any versions of that in Canada you can toss out to us?
Yeah, mostly, I guess the newspapers, Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail are the two big papers here. If there's any connection to be made with them, then that would help. We have Maclean's as a magazine here. And
Maclean's?
Maclean's, yeah, that's a news. It'd be like a Canadian version of Time magazine, maybe, or something.
Got it. Forgive my American ignorance.
No worries. And then there's a variety of radio talk shows. CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They'd be worth pitching your book to. They have a number of programs, and they talk to authors mostly as an expert on a particular subject, more so than promoting your book. It is a publicly funded broadcaster, so it's not like they are trying to commercialize by helping people sell books, but they do want to interview very interesting and well-respected people who are experts in the U.S. So it would be after that. I think I've covered it mostly. There's CBC is the biggest Canadian broadcaster, and then they also have radio, CBC radio, but there's a whole bunch of radio stations that.
So guys, it's the same answer north of the border as it is south of the border. It's about media. It's about platform. It's getting the word out. Unfortunately, giving birth to your book is just the beginning. Your job, if you want to get a publishing deal, is you have to prove to the publisher that you know how to raise that book, and the proof's in the pudding. You got to show them what you got. So we're going to go back to some of the questions that these our attendees are asking. If you don't mind, Lloyd, I'm working without a net. Here we go. Now, guys, Lloyd is brilliant. Scary brilliant, scary smart, like Mensa quality, but he may not know some stuff. So I'm going to throw some questions at him, and he's allowed to say he doesn't know. Just be nice. Lloyd, people are asking me about the religious or the Christian market, which is a very big market down here in the States. How do Christian books do up in Canada? Do you have a market like we do down here?
Yes, we do. We have a Christian bookstore market. It is not nearly the size of the American Christian book market. Previously, there was even a CBA show here in Canada. That went away many years ago. It wasn't well attended. So, needless to say, there's still a strong Christian book market here in Canada. It's just, if I was to say of overall books, you could generally think that a typical book in the U.S. market would sell 5% in Canada. A typical Christian book in the U.S. might sell 2%.
Okay, those are great numbers. So, Lloyd, thank you.
And HarperCollins, as you know, owns Zondervan and also now owns Thomas Nelson. So they are, I do know the religious market very well from that experience.
All right. What about children's books? How do children's books do up in Canada?
Great. In fact, Canada's best-selling all-time author is a children's author. His name is Robert Munch. Wrote a book called Love You Forever, and it's sold over maybe 30 million copies worldwide. Mm-hmm. So he has outsold Margaret Atwood. Children's books are very strong. Board books. I don't know what.
Board books? All of a sudden, where did they come from all of a sudden again?
They have their own sections here.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
If you had asked me 15 years ago, I would have said, yeah, they're going away. But no. Of course, if you'd asked me 15 years ago about libraries, ooh, Lloyd, tell me about libraries in Canada. Because I got to tell you, here in the States, they're doing beautifully, but I hear it's a very different story up in Canada.
Yeah. Okay. So from there, children's books are probably even stronger in library market. Just to segue over, we do not. There's really no direct calling on libraries or library boards anymore. It's all handled through the wholesale market.
Mm-hmm.
So there are. There's really a couple, maybe 4 library wholesalers that everyone goes and presents to, and then they take everybody's books and go to the library boards and make massive presentations. I presume there's some similarities in that in the U.S., but there's really no branch calls or regional calls even here in Canada done anymore.
Well, and we're reading in the media that you've got a lot of branch closures, that there's less and less funding for libraries lately. So let me ask you, those big library wholesalers, feel free to say you don't know, but do you have names of 1 or 2 you could share with us?
The Library Service Center is one of them. Wait a minute, I did have them here.
And guys, while he's looking them up, this is Lloyd working without a net. I'm going to, even if he can't find them, I'm going to be posting a copy of this video online for all of you, and I will list the wholesalers that he's coming up with. I will list them on that page. So if you are signed up for this webinar, you will get an email with a link to a recording of what we're doing here, and I will I will spell them out. So don't freak out if you don't get the names right. I got you covered. I got you. So Library Service Center.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, right now I'm drawing a blank on it.
Well, that was not fair if he wasn't.
I'll send it to you, and then maybe you can post it. Is that okay?
Yeah. Now, we've got a lot of self-published and indie-published authors down here who are all asking what Canadian bookstores think of self-published or independently published books. Be honest.
Yeah, tough, really. Unless there's something that's going to drive it by itself. Unfortunately, they're not going to be able to help drive that book and make connections unless there's some specific group that needs a book on parenthood that you've written, then maybe they'll be able to connect that. But generally speaking, you're on your own.
Well, it's the same down here. We have to drive the sales if we're independently published. Now, when you would walk into Chapters Indigo or any one of the independent bookstores with a HarperCollins bag, guys, I sold to Lloyd for years and his crew. I can tell you this, I went with these guys on these calls. Not even HarperCollins gets all their books into Chapters Indigo. I mean, it's not even the, a lot of those books never ever get on the shelf. So if HarperCollins can't get all their books on the shelf, it is very competitive. So David, what advice, if any, do you have for self-published authors? Is there any difference in how they might want to present themselves to bookstores?
There's just got to be some unique angle, somewhere that you've expanded your platform. It's just really what you're doing. In this case, I think it's very similar. Whatever it is you're doing to break your book out in the U.S. market, you've got to just pretend Canada's part of that and do the same. So if it means knocking on doors and trying to reach out to bloggers who can speak up your book, then you got to do that here too in Canada. Now,
distribution was a big part of what kept HarperCollins.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, but with us small guys, we've got 1 or 2 books that we're publishing ourselves. We don't have distribution. Do you know if there's any wholesalers or distributors that Chapters Indigo or that the booksellers really love to work with?
Well, fortunately, that's right in your own backyard. They love buying those books through Ingram.
All right. That's
Ingram's a
wonderful
huge,
news.
yeah, yeah. So that's just a matter of making sure that when you connect with Ingram, that they're also presenting this book to the Canadian accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that. So that's
Yes.
probably the most straightforward way in that respect, to make sure that's being done, unless you feel there's some unique angle that's bigger than that. That's just for your pure distribution into Canada. I've got my one book here. I want to get it into Canada. Ingram's a pretty good vehicle for that. However, if it's bigger than that, then you need to, sort out, can I get a publishing deal with maybe, if not one of the big multinationals, then one of the more medium-sized players.
Well, talk a little bit about that if you would. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you work with clients, but I mean, guys, he's here to help us out, but also he knows his stuff about how to get published. We've got a few questions here from people asking how to get published in Canada. Do you have perhaps some guidelines or some ways that you work with people, some suggestions you have for people who want to get published in Canada?
And so if you do feel you have that, what it takes to make that breakthrough in Canada, get over that curve, then I think it's the best way to do it is through an agent. Most of the publishers are not going to look at unsolicited manuscripts or finished books. Potentially, if you said, oh, this has sold 100,000 copies in the U.S., can you take a look at this, please, HarperCollins Canada or Penguin Random House Canada? They might notice that. That's pretty successful. So, you'd have to have made that big break already in the U.S. to get any attention from a Canadian publisher, large or small. Otherwise, you need to find yourself an agent that can help represent you.
And what sort of things are you agents looking for? I mean, what is your hot buttons versus what are things you're not looking for? I mean, I'm good either way.
Yeah, well, it's easier. Maybe it's easier to say what I am looking for, and what agents look for is obviously that platform. And I keep going back to that, but I can't tell you what a difference that makes if there's some kind of platform.
It's the key for everything.
It is totally, and like you really got to work on that. That's as hard as writing the book, and for some people they fear it maybe, or they just can't do it, or they can't get it started. Well, you know what? If your book's going to be a success, you've got to work that angle in the U.S. and in Canada. Even to get me to look at it, I can't really. I wouldn't be able to do something with it, even if I just loved the book, unless there was some kind of backing to it. Is there a market for it? Have you researched if there's a book you're writing about, parenting, for instance? Is that exactly the same market in Canada? So do that research on whatever particular subject it is that you're writing about, and make sure that it exists here. It should, it likely does, but the more you know about it, the better.
All right, good. Now, to harken back to your old job just for a second, and then we'll jump ahead to your new job again. But we've got a number of questions about people who want to approach bookstores, approach libraries the way we do here in the States. And I know that we offer here a great deal of advice as to what the materials look like. You used to run an extremely large sales force very recently up in Canada. Yeah. What materials do bookstores look for when they're trying to decide, up in Canada, if I was going to take my most recent book and I was going to send packages, should I do email? Should I do post mail? If I do email, what are they looking for? What materials should I provide to get a bookseller's attention up in Canada?
Yeah, well, it's just basically whatever you would have provided to whomever you're working with in the U.S. It's really the same. They need to see if there's, some graphics or illustrations, photos, maybe one or two. They're looking for a sampling. What does the cover look like? Your biography should be included. What books your bibliography, what else you've written. Maybe it's just blogs, maybe it's articles, whatever it is that led you up to write this book. you know, it's just to pretend they don't know, which you, and no offense, they don't. You know, most people don't. So that you just got to pretend, keep that in the back of your mind, even if you think, oh, people might know this already. Just say it, present it, and you know, make it as succinct as possible. You don't need to send a lot. The less, the better. So the more compressed you can make your.
Hey, I say one sheet. Get it all on an 8.5 by 11.
Yeah.
They can't look at it. Yeah, they have to turn the page.
That's like a catalog page that any publisher has. It's ideal. Get yourselves a catalog from HarperCollins or Penguin or something. Look at that. What are they putting on that page? Because that's what the buyers are looking at constantly.
All right.
Accustomed to.
Lloyd, in your experience now as an agent, do you find that Canadian publishers give Canadian authors more chances? Is it harder to get published in Canada if you're a U.S. author?
I would say no. It's really based on what the saleability is of that book. So the Canadian publishing programs are often made up of international books. I would say it could be half and half. So there's a big opportunity for Americans to pitch their books to a Canadian publisher. Obviously, they're heavy with Canadian authored books. That's where we are. Otherwise there'd be no Canadian books probably. But yeah, you have a chance just like anyone else. If the borders don't matter where you're from.
Now, do you find the same is true for the retailers and libraries when it comes to U.S. publishers? Do you think that in your experience, Chapters Indigo, some of these bookstores, do you have a better shot if you're published by a Canadian publisher as opposed to a U.S. publisher?
Yes, absolutely. So it's critical that when you've made that jump and you can get a Canadian publisher on board, it is going to have a dramatic effect on the sale of your book. It might get you from that 1,000 that was lost in the middle of a HarperCollins list up to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 copies and beyond.
All right. Well, Kizzy and Larry, that question was for you. So yes, going to a Canadian publisher does make a difference in the Canadian market. So for those of you who own the rights to your book and who have published in the United States, that means you still have the world rights. You might want to seriously consider selling the Canadian rights to a Canadian publisher. Now, Lloyd, would a Canadian publisher be at all interested also in the UK rights? Would they purchase just Canada? Would they want everything?
Mm-hmm.
What would they want?
Generally, it's only going to be Canadian rights that might be offered, but in many cases, they do also buy world rights excluding the U.S.
Okay.
The U.S. is all locked up. Some Canadian publishers, like they are at all the fairs and shows, Frankfurt and London, Beijing, and wherever they are. So they get connections made that they might have that whoever it is you're dealing with in the U.S. doesn't have.
All right.
They are quite successful, I'd say, at selling rights internationally. So it could be considered, and might make it easier for you as an author and a small publisher to have one other publisher take care of your international interests.
All right. Now, you're representing a series of authors right now down here in the States, correct, as well?
I don't have any in the U.S. right now, no.
Oh, I meant Canadian authors. I thought you were representing them to publishers here in the States, I mean. No, you're just all about Canada.
They're really pretty focused on Canada right now. That's where
That's why you're here.
Yeah, exactly. That's where it seems to be. I would, if the opportunity opens up, and I think it may on something I'm hoping that comes through, have an international market for one particular book.
All right.
But there's the others I'm working on are fairly Canadian, I would say. I hope that through what I'm going to do, and this is a good example. I'm pitching a children's author to a Canadian publisher that has an American distribution through Hachette. So
nice.
that book, I make that one sale to Kids Can Press, they're called, here in Canada.
Oh,
and
wow.
they're associated with Hachette globally. Actually, they'll take this book globally. I think it'll be a huge bestseller globally. It might even be bigger globally than in Canada. So that's very exciting for me. So yes, I am representing some people into the U.S. market.
Now, we've got a question here from a couple people. They were wondering if you would be kind enough to once again list off, and guys, I will type, for those of you who are watching a replay, I'll type this below, but would you list off those top publishers in Canada again for us?
Yeah, I can send some cheat notes here that I pulled together that have other descriptions of things we're not going to be able to probably talk about today. But the rest of the market, for instance, and some of the mass merchant wholesalers here are also important to talk about. I don't know if we have time, maybe we'll just touch on that.
Believe it or not, Lloyd, we have quite a bit of time left. We still have 15, 20 minutes, and I am thrilled because my next question was going to be, what am I not asking you? But what were those top 4 publishers before we go on? And then
So Penguin Random House, they're the same here as they are in the U.S. They're the biggest by far, probably 30% of the market, I'm going to guess, on both sides of the market. Border. And then HarperCollins, generally number 2, and Simon & Schuster might be number 3. Hachette in Canada is probably call them number 4. So I think they might fall in that same order in the U.S. in ranking. All
right.
To you?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Let's get into Amazon. Let's talk about mass market distribution. Let's talk about distributors.
Right.
What do you think? What would you want people to know? I'm going to, instead of leading the question, I'm going to ask you, what do you got for us?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to consider here the non-traditional book market, which is served by mass market wholesalers. So, your book might do really, really well in supermarkets and drug chains and not sell very well at, say, Indigo. If it's something racy or salacious, especially, what sells in drugstores and supermarkets. It's got to be something that pops, catches the eye quickly, and it's usually something with a bit of edge to it. So you got to really make sure that whoever it is you're working with has a good focus, a good grip on the mass merchant channel. So
and who are some of the big jobbers or distributors up there?
We have 2. One of them is CMMI.
That's right. Wow.
CMMI, Canadian Mass Merchant something. I forget. Anyway, CMMI will do it. And so they primarily take care of Walmart. That whole book section in Walmart, they handle it completely. Staples, as well as some of the drug chains, hardware stores. Maybe you have a home construction, home rental book. So CMMI would get your books into, we also have, of course, Home Depot and Lowe's here in Canada, as well as some of our own brands of hardware stores that they would get your book into potentially.
But would they be looking for books that use metric instead of SAE?
No, that's okay. I'm quite the handyman myself, and I have not converted to metric. There are a few things, believe it or not, that we still measure in Imperial. They'll have both on it, but everyone ignores the metric.
Really? I had no idea.
We still buy 2x4s, for instance. I don't even know what that is in metric. So Mike Holmes, he was one of my authors at HarperCollins that I published very successfully, and I think he's broken out pretty nicely in the U.S. market too on the HGTV network, and Fox actually carried his program, Mike Holmes, Homes on Homes. I don't know if people resonate with that, but his book, we did actually 2 versions of that for the Canadian market. We did have a combined metric and Imperial measurement edition for Canada, and then just the Imperial. We call it Imperial. What do you call it? Standard measurement.
We SAE standard, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Leave it to the Americans to call our version the standard.
Yes. So yeah, the mass merchant channel is also handled by the news group. Now, the news group
Oh,
was also in the U.S. market. They've retracted and they're back in Canada only, as I understand it now. But they're very, very huge in the with the supermarket chains. Loblaw is our biggest supermarket chain, I would say, followed by Overweighty and Safeway. So they handle all that. And mostly what they do, of course, is magazines. Just a ton of magazines. But they also get to handle the books while they're at it, going into all the drug chains and supermarkets. And so, yeah, they are essential. If your book has mass appeal, you got to make sure whoever it is you're dealing with, whatever publisher, because some don't. Some just are not in that arena. Some are scared of it because the returns are so high.
I remember. I have sold to CMMI for my Cup of Comfort days. And yeah, 50, 60% returns.
Well, yeah, and they're happy with that. The wholesalers think that's great. No publisher likes that at all. You know, that's so some will stay away now, which just has its good points and its bad points. It leaves more room for other books to sell through. So they are becoming more efficient as well, I will say. The news group is particularly, they've really improved in their efficiencies, I will say. So it can be good for you, especially if your book has a mass appeal to it.
Terrific. So I'm just going to throw a quick question at guys. We have 8 minutes left on the hour. Unlike in Canada, this hour does not have 22 minutes. It's a full hour, full 60 minutes. I will never forget the first time I ever met Lloyd, and he explained to me what talking to Americans was all about, and I laughed so hard I hurt myself. But in these last 8 minutes, I'm going to hit Lloyd up with some Amazon questions, some other questions. But Lloyd, the one thing people are asking is, can they get a hold of you and how? Now, guys, you will see under Lloyd's beautiful face here, you will see that I've got his website, kellyconsultingagency.com. But is there any other way that people can get a hold of you, or should they just go to your website and handle it that way? Is there?
Well, considering it's right there, I don't see it, but it must be there.
kellyconsultingagency.com. And guys, I'll also put that in the chat box right now.
Okay, that is the best way to go about reaching me. My email address is lloyd@kellyconsultingagency.com as well. Lloyd at. So,
I am putting both in the chat box right now, guys, an actual link to each. Yeah.
So I'm happy to, do the best I can at, telling you what it is that you're asking. I really think that there's so many specifics that it's hard to generalize sometimes. But,
yes, guys, he's not going to be able to become your personal consultant, I'm afraid.
I would like to mention something else, if I could, touch on what we call BookNet Canada. So you have BookScan.
Yes.
Right, in the U.S. It's, I think, fairly comparable, fairly similar. BookNet Canada is a federally funded organization, nonprofit organization, which tracks all, no, I shouldn't say all, most POS.
Good.
80% of all book sales are tracked through BookNet Canada. So, for instance, when you're making your pitches to agents, publishers that take your book in Canada here, it'd be great if you could reach out to someone and say, I'm looking for some comp books, what we call comp books.
We do too.
You have a parent book. What are some other parent books that might be like mine, and how many copies did they sell? Find the good ones. There's always good ones. And there are others that haven't done so well. So you want to make sure you're prepared to answer that, because they'll say, well, that sounds like this book over here, and it didn't do so well. But
now, keep in mind, guys, you get on the phone from Duluth, Georgia, and you call a Vancouver bookstore. They're a little busy. They're not going to drop everything to help you do your comp research. I want to be clear. You need to do your research ahead of time. And Lloyd, can people just Google, what's the name of that organization again? BookNet? What is it?
BookNet, no, unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to get it. So you'd have to have a contact here to get it for you. It's a closed to members. So you have to be in the publishing. You have to have a publishing membership.
All right. So, the best bet you have at this point then is perhaps your Canadian ranking, your Canadian sales on Amazon. You know, some idea of how you're doing compared to the comp titles.
Yeah, that's a great idea too, to look at what the competitive titles are on Amazon and see what the rankings are. Yeah.
Now, here in the States, Amazon now, it was higher, but Amazon is now responsible for approximately 49% of new book sales.
Wow.
It used to be 60, but it's gone down a little bit because they've gotten a little focused on push-up bras and dog food.
Yes.
So,
same here.
How's Amazon.ca doing, and do you see any recent changes in how Amazon is working with books?
Yes, I would say definitely. It's probably similar to what you're experiencing there. I would say that Amazon sales, especially if you go back 10 years, which is most of it, maybe, of where they really started to gain traction, has doubled or tripled here in Canada. They may not be at quite as high at 50% of book sales, but they're probably approaching, I'm going to say around 35 to 40%. I don't think quite 40% of the book market here in Canada. Indigo.ca is also quite strong.
Really?
Yeah, it is, because it was here already, even before Amazon. Somebody brilliant here developed it. It was a small, not so small, but as an independent bookseller. This guy was a genius at creating websites, and he started, and he actually sold his website to Indigo. It was so successful. And then Amazon and Indigo thought they were going to be, before there was such a thing as Amazon, they thought they were going to be, quote, like the Amazon here. And then Amazon landed. So the rest is history, but they're still quite strong. I would say in Canada, so Indigo bricks and mortar, just to also give some perspective, might make up about 25 to 28% of the market. And then, as I was saying, Amazon probably, let's call them around 35%. And,
Amazon's 35% and Indigo's 28%?
Yeah, I would say, and approximately. And then there's independently owned bookstores still. To be honest with you, in Canada, there's probably only 50 that matter anymore. It's really sad. I had 50 back in the day when I had my own territory as a sales rep 30-something years ago at HarperCollins. But
it's so different here in the States. I don't know if you're aware of this, but our independent market is exploding. There's 700 more independent bookstores now than there were in 2009. Wow. It's unbelievable. Yeah. And they're growing like crazy. We've got a 35% increase in independent bookstores just in the last 5 years. I
hear that. You know, I'm envious when I hear that they're opening, because honestly, they are some of the best booksellers. They really care, and they, not to say that they don't, some wonderful people in chain stores too, but often they just take it so much more personally and take it so much more further than, you know, than someone working in a chain store can. But, you know, it's probably around 7% that's left in terms of the entire market. McNally Robinson is one of the bigger players in the independent market. They're based out of Winnipeg. But again, they only have, I think it's 4 stores now. That's not too big. But that's about as big as it gets. And one of the finest children's bookstores anywhere. They have been ranked as the top bookstore in North America. It's Vancouver Kids Books. And
now, we got a question from Kizzy about bookshops on Vancouver Island. She's got a children's picture book. So what's that one called?
Well, that's in Vancouver, on the mainland in British Columbia.
Vancouver and Vancouver Island are 2 different things.
Yes, they are separate. So, yeah, there's Bolin Books out in, on Vancouver Island. It's a very big, large format independent bookstore. It's a single store, though. But on the mainland, it's Vancouver Kids Books. It's just known as Kids Books. That's the name of the store.
Lloyd, This has been the most amazing hour. I can't believe it's flown by. You have given us so much information about Canada. It makes me want to go, you know, chug some maple syrup and have some poutine.
Oh, right.
But guys, now again, kellyconsultingagency.com. Lloyd is a different sort of service provider than I am. He can't answer a million questions for free. That's so, you know, don't pepper. But if you are interested in his services and what he maybe can do for you as an agent or a consultant, because he is running an agent consulting agency, I would highly recommend that you get a hold of him at lloyd@kellyconsultingagency.com. And I can't recommend him enough. His knowledge of the industry and what he knows about Canada, it's going to help you increase your sales and increase your publishing program. Lloyd, before I let you go, is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have? Anything that you would like to end with today?
Listen, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with my fellow colleagues in publishing in the United States or wherever else you may be as well. I understand not all in the United States, but you know, it's certainly a market you really should try to explore. If you feel you've got something very strong, if you are committed to it, then it's just a matter of making that next step and finding somebody who can be committed to your book here in Canada. It is an additional step, so don't miss it. And don't just necessarily think, oh, I got a distributor in the U.S. that's going to handle Canada for me. That's fine. That might be okay, but you might end up with 1,000 copies instead of 3,000. Okay.
Oh, guys, thank you. And Lloyd, thank you for this hour. I owe you big. I owe you dinner at Mildred Pierce next time I'm in Toronto.
Well, I can't wait to see you sometime.
All right. Guys, thank you, Lloyd, so much for giving everyone this great information. And guys, we will see you next week on our next New Shelf session. Have a wonderful day, and I hope everyone has a terrific time selling into the Canadian market. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.